All right, guys. Tonight's notes, or today's notes, depending on when you're doing these, are entitled To Declare Independence or Not. So, when we left things off, we had seen the first shots fired in a war between the colonists and Great Britain. Even though shots have been fired, that doesn't necessarily mean that a new country needs to be created. And what we're going to look at tonight are the different ideas, the different sides in this question of should the colonists declare independence or not. So we need to start historically and understand that the colonial leaders came together again at the Second Continental Congress. If you remember the First Continental Congress, one of the things that they said was if things are not improving, we need to get back together for another meeting. And obviously, we saw the battles of Lexington and Concord. Relations between the colonists and the British are not improving. So in 1775, we have the Second Continental Congress, which is called together. Now, several things come out of the Second Continental Congress. The first is that they agreed to create a continental army. This would be a new army of all the colonies, and they chose George Washington to lead it. You guys should remember George Washington was a military leader in the French and Indian War. He was also one of the leaders of the Virginia militia, so he was somebody who made sense in that role as leader of the Continental Army. They also debated the question at the Second Continental Congress of whether or not the colonies should declare independence from Britain. They raised this army and knew they needed to protect their interests, but the idea of should we separate entirely or stay with Britain had not been settled. And they make one final attempt to get in touch with King George and try and reconcile directly with the king. And they send what's called the Olive Branch Petition. The Olive Branch Petition was sent by the colonists to King George, and it offered a peaceful solution to all of the issues between the colonists and Great Britain. It's called the Olive Branch Petition because the olive branch is a symbol of peace. But at this point, King George is fed up with the colonists. He thinks that they're in open rebellion, and he wants nothing to do with this Olive Branch Petition. He refuses to even read it. So the Olive Branch Petition fails. All right? So what are some of the ideas that are going through the minds of these colonial leaders at the Second Continental Congress? Well, they're really influenced by two things and two people. The first is a pamphlet called Common Sense. Common Sense was a widely published pamphlet read throughout the colonies. It was written by a guy named Thomas Paine, who was a recent immigrant from Britain to the colonies. Thomas Paine was a patriot. When we've looked at our three groups, patriots, moderates, and loyalists, Thomas Paine is absolutely a patriot. He was pro-independence and argued that it was common sense that the colonies should split from Great Britain. They should break away, establish their own country. On top of that, he also said that the colonies shouldn't just break away and start their own country, but that country should have a different form of government than Great Britain had. They should get rid of monarchy, get rid of a king, and instead establish a new country that is run by a representative democracy as the form of government. So Thomas Paine's Common Sense is a pamphlet, short little book, and it's being circulated all through the colonies. And these ideas are going to be very popular among many of the people at Second Continental Congress. The other ideas that are going to be very influential at the Second Continental Congress are the ideas put together by John Locke. John Locke was an English philosopher, and he had argued that people have natural rights. You'll hear the conversation of natural rights a lot if you read primary sources from the time period. He says people have the natural rights to life, liberty or freedom, and property, the ability to own things. And he argued that there was a social contract in place, and this is probably his most famous idea, that there's a social contract, an agreement between the government and the people in a country. In that social contract, the people agreed to obey the government as long as the government did its job and protected the people's rights. As long as their rights of life, liberty, and property were protected, the people were obligated to obey the government. If, however, the government didn't protect those rights or infringed upon those rights, then the people have the right to overthrow their government and create a new one. So these are the ideas that are going around in the minds of the Continental leaders as they convene for the Second Continental Congress. So let's look at some of the arguments that they're going to put forth. So we're going to start with arguments for independence. So these are the arguments that the patriots are making. One is that Britain has been a bad parent country. It has not met the requirements of this social contract. It's been taking away the colonists' freedom. Two, if the colonists break free, they could trade with anyone they want to. It would get rid of all those rules from the Navigation Acts, those rules that we saw with the Game of Empire. All right, that mercantilist system would be gone, and so now would be okay for them to trade freely with anyone. The colonists are also tired of Britain taxing the colonists without the ability to represent themselves or have a voice in that taxation. So that idea of no taxation without representation, they're tired of it. And if the colonists break free, we'll make sure that we have a voice in any decisions regarding taxes. And then finally, war had already started, right? The colonists and Great Britain were at war with each other. Whether that war was over independence, not necessarily decided, but war had been started. Shots had been fired, blood had been spilled. And there's really no going back, is what they would say. All right? It's now we have to break free. We have to formally split from Great Britain now that war has broken out. Now, on the opposite side, the arguments made by the loyalists, so the arguments against independence, first they start by pointing out that there are a lot of benefits from being connected with Great Britain. There's a lot of financial benefits. You have a built-in trade partner, somebody who is automatically going to want to buy your raw materials, who will return finished goods to you. It's a good financial arrangement. Great Britain also is one of the most well-established empires in the world at the time. Part of that empire is that they have they're really the strongest army and navy in the world. And so they can use that navy and army to protect us against any enemies that might rise up, whether it's old enemies like the Spanish or Native Americans or any new enemies that might arrive. They also argue that creating a brand new country is not a simple task. It is a lot of work. All right. And there's no guarantee that breaking away is going to make things better. It's almost more likely that breaking away is going to make things worse. You see it historically all the time. Countries that are newly created fail more frequently than they succeed. Creating a new country from scratch is not an easy task. And it's very possible that you could make things worse, not better, by declaring independence. So your response questions for these notes, you've got two of them. So which of the arguments for independence is the strongest, and why do you think that? So look at that argument, the list of arguments for independence. Choose the one that you think is the strongest, the most convincing, and explain why you think it's so convincing. And then, again, look at the other side. Which of the arguments against independence is the strongest? So choose the one that you think is the most convincing there and explain why you think that. All right? Go ahead and answer those response questions and print your notes when you are finished.